Yu Menglong's death did not arrive with chaos or spectacle. It arrived with silence, a silence so complete and so controlled that it unsettled people far more than any dramatic headline ever could. Because for a young celebrity whose name should have dominated public discussion for weeks, the story surfaced briefly, slowed almost immediately, and then began to dissolve, leaving behind only fragments, gaps, and a growing sense that something had been deliberately left unfinished. To many observers, that silence felt disturbingly familiar, not because they could point to one identical case, but because the emotional rhythm of the situation felt recycled, as if they had witnessed the same sequence unfold before, under different names and circumstances. At first, the explanation presented to the public seemed simple enough: a personal tragedy shaped by private struggles, an abrupt ending that required sympathy but no deeper examination. And for a moment, that explanation appeared to settle the issue. Yet what truly disturbed people was not the explanation itself, but the speed and precision with which everything stopped afterward. Because the public narrative did not deepen, the timeline did not expand, no additional context emerged. Instead, the case seemed to hit an invisible ceiling beyond which discussion could not rise, as though an unspoken boundary had been reached. This was the moment when unease began to replace shock. Because shock fades quickly, but unresolved silence lingers, and it was precisely this silence that prompted a quiet but persistent question to circulate online. Why does this keep happening the same way? Why do certain celebrity deaths follow an eerily consistent arc, regardless of era, personality, or background, beginning with rising pressure that only becomes visible in hindsight, followed by subtle behavioral changes, a sudden and unresolved death, and then a rapid narrowing of information until the story becomes inert? Any single case can be explained away as coincidence, but repetition has a different weight. And when people began revisiting Yu Menglong's final appearances with this pattern in mind, small details that once seemed insignificant started to feel heavier, his tone more restrained than before, his words carefully measured, his expressions carrying a fatigue that did not align with his age or public image, creating the impression of someone navigating limits that were never openly defined, limits that did not come from fans or critics, but from somewhere higher, quieter, and far less visible. This is where speculation naturally entered the story, not as accusation or proof, but as a response to repetition. As some began to wonder whether Yu Menglong's death fit into a broader, unspoken structure that activates when fame intersects with power, a structure in which entertainment does not exist independently but operates beneath larger systems that prioritize stability over transparency, where visibility becomes leverage, talent becomes risk, and silence becomes the most effective form of control. No one can say with certainty that this is what happened in Yu Menglong's case, but the questions refuse to disappear. Why did discussion shrink instead of grow? Why were so many details left unresolved? Why did the case feel finished before it ever felt understood? And why do these same questions resurface whenever a similar death occurs? Because Yu Menglong's story matters not because it proves anything, but because it echoes something unresolved, something that has surfaced before, faded before, and now appears once again, raising a question far more unsettling than any single explanation. Why does this pattern keep repeating? Before his death, Yu Menglong occupied a position that looked stable from the outside, but felt increasingly constrained beneath the surface. Because publicly, he remained visible, still appearing in projects, still maintaining the image expected of him. Yet the rhythm of his career had subtly shifted in ways that only became obvious afterward. Schedules grew irregular, appearances felt cautious rather than confident, and the spontaneity that once defined his presence seemed to give way to restraint, as if every move had to be weighed against unseen consequences. Those who followed his content closely later pointed out moments where his tone changed, where enthusiasm was replaced by careful neutrality, creating the impression of someone operating within boundaries that were never openly acknowledged. When news of his death first emerged, the public reaction was immediate shock, but that shock quickly transformed into confusion. Because information arrived in fragments rather than clarity, official statements were brief and generalized. And instead of a natural expansion of facts that usually follows the death of a public figure, the flow of information narrowed almost immediately. Conversations that initially surged across social platforms began to stall, posts disappeared without explanation, and discussions lost momentum as if they were being gently but firmly redirected elsewhere. This response did not feel chaotic or accidental. It felt managed, echoing the way sensitive matters are often handled when they risk drifting beyond entertainment and into domains where reputations, authority, and broader stability are involved. In such environments, visibility can quickly transform from asset to liability, because attention attracts scrutiny, and scrutiny can expose connections that extend beyond the individual. Yu Menglong's case appeared to follow this logic, not through overt suppression, but through quiet coordination, where no single action stood out as extraordinary, yet the cumulative effect was unmistakable. An atmosphere in which asking questions felt increasingly difficult and continuing to ask them felt risky. This is why some observers began to describe his death, not simply as a personal tragedy, but as an example of how narratives are controlled once they brush against invisible boundaries, boundaries that separate public sympathy from collective discomfort and personal loss from stories that the system prefers to keep contained. As attention slowly shifted away from the immediate shock of Yu Menglong's death, a different kind of unease began to settle in. Because when people stopped focusing on isolated details and instead compared how the story unfolded to other cases they remembered, similarities emerged that felt too consistent to ignore, not in cause, but in structure, not in names, but in sequence. And this is where the idea of a repeating pattern became impossible to dismiss. In multiple past celebrity deaths that once ignited public concern, the same progression appeared with unsettling regularity, a phase of rising pressure that often went unnoticed at the time, subtle behavioral changes that only made sense afterward, a sudden and unresolved ending, and then a rapid contraction of information where timelines froze and narratives arrived already simplified. What tied these cases together was not proof of coordination, but the uniformity of response, because each time the system reacted in nearly the same way, allowing just enough explanation to close the story while leaving critical gaps untouched. Observers noted that when a death remains firmly within the realm of personal tragedy, scrutiny tends to intensify, questions multiply, and media pressure grows louder. But when a case drifts too close to interests larger than the individual, the opposite occurs. Discussion contracts, ambiguity becomes normalized, and silence settles in, as if it were the natural conclusion. Yu Menglong's death followed this same trajectory with striking precision, not through visible conflict or competing explanations, but through an absence of evolution, where no prolonged questioning phase ever truly took shape, and contradictions were never reconciled in public view. For many, this raised a troubling possibility that the pattern is not about what happens to these individuals, but about how situations are managed once they threaten to cross invisible lines, lines separating entertainment from influence, personal loss from systemic discomfort. The more people compared timelines, public reactions, and the speed with which attention was redirected elsewhere, the clearer it became that Yu Menglong's case did not feel exceptional at all. It felt familiar, as if it fit neatly into a template that had already been used before, not as a script written in advance, but as a response perfected over time, reinforcing the sense that what mattered most was not resolving every question, but ensuring that the questions themselves never grew beyond control. As the sense of repetition became harder to ignore, a more controversial explanation began circulating quietly among observers who felt that coincidence alone could no longer account for what they were seeing, and this is where theory entered the story. Not as proof, but as an attempt to explain why the same structure kept reappearing across different cases. According to this line of thinking, deaths like Yu Menglong's are not defined by a single moment or decision, but by an environment where certain outcomes become acceptable once an individual's visibility drifts too close to sensitive zones of power, zones where reputation, hierarchy, and stability matter more than transparency. Supporters of this theory argue that when a figure is perceived as potentially disruptive, inconvenient, or uncontrollable, the system does not need to act loudly. It only needs to act early, shaping conditions so that resolution never fully arrives and responsibility dissolves into ambiguity. They point to how quickly silence takes hold, how narratives stop evolving, and how unanswered questions are allowed to fade rather than escalate, creating the impression that nothing dramatic occurred while ensuring nothing is truly examined. Another element frequently cited is timing, because in several comparable cases, moments of personal strain coincided with periods when larger systems were under pressure. moments when maintaining order outweighed the cost of unanswered questions, making containment preferable to investigation. Some take the theory further, suggesting that repetition itself may serve a function, not as punishment, but as signaling, a quiet reminder to those within the system of where boundaries lie and what happens when they are crossed, whether intentionally or inadvertently. Again, there is no direct evidence of this, only a convergence of behavior patterns that appear too consistent to dismiss outright. And it is this consistency that gives the theory its unsettling power, because it relies not on dramatic accusations, but on observation, recurrence, and the uncomfortable realization that silence, when applied systematically, can be as effective as force. In Yu Menglong's case, the theory does not claim to explain his death, but it does attempt to explain why his story ended the way it did, abruptly, quietly, and without closure, reinforcing the belief that the most decisive moments in such cases may occur far from public view, long before the public even realizes there is a story to question. What ultimately unsettles many observers is not any single allegation or theory, but the way silence itself appears to function as an organized response in cases like Yu Menglong's. Because silence in such environments is rarely accidental, it is produced through layers of habit, caution, and unspoken understanding that govern what can safely be discussed and what must be left untouched. Within tightly managed systems, power does not need to announce itself openly. It operates through anticipation, through the shared awareness that certain narratives stabilize order while others threaten it. And once a story begins drifting toward discomfort, the response is rarely confrontation, it is containment. This is why Yu Menglong's case felt less like a mystery being investigated and more like a subject being quietly sealed, not through dramatic censorship, but through the gradual removal of space for inquiry, where questions were not answered but slowly stopped circulating. In such structures, responsibility does not disappear. It disperses, becoming so fragmented that no single actor appears accountable, while the outcome remains the same, an unresolved ending that feels intentional without ever being declared as such. What makes this pattern especially troubling is how normalized it has become, because repetition transforms silence from an imposition into an expectation, teaching both media and the public how far a story is allowed to travel before it must settle. Yu Menglong's death seemed to reach that settlement point quickly, where public attention peaked briefly before being redirected, leaving behind a hollow center filled with unanswered questions and no visible path forward. This does not require explicit orders or visible enforcement, only a shared understanding across institutions, industries, and individuals that some stories are safer when left unfinished, and that understanding itself is what gives silence its enduring power, creating a space where curiosity persists, but accountability remains distant, reinforcing the sense that Yu Menglong's death was not only about a life lost, but about how systems instinctively protect themselves when faced with narratives they cannot fully control. What remains after everything that has been said is not an answer, but a lingering echo, because Yu Menglong's death never truly settled into the past. It stayed suspended in the spaces where explanations should have existed. And it is precisely that absence which continues to unsettle people long after public attention has moved on. Patterns do not accuse anyone on their own. They simply repeat quietly and persistently until recognition begins to replace certainty. And Yu Menglong's case became one of those moments where the discomfort came not from knowing too much, but from realizing how little was allowed to be known in a situation that should have invited clarity. Perhaps his death was the result of personal circumstances converging at the worst possible moment. Perhaps it was shaped by pressures far more complex than the public can see. Or perhaps the truth exists somewhere in between, obscured by layers that were never meant to be peeled back. But what cannot be ignored is how familiar the ending felt, how quickly silence took hold, and how naturally the story was allowed to fade without resolution. When the same structure appears again and again, it forces a question that goes beyond any single individual. It asks what kind of environment allows tragedies to repeat without explanation, what kind of system benefits from unfinished stories, and why so many people sense that these deaths follow rules no one is willing to describe openly. Yu Menglong's story does not demand belief. It demands attention. Because until the pattern is broken, challenged, or fully understood, it will continue to surface under new names and new faces, leaving behind the same uneasy feeling that something important was lost, not only in the moment of death, but in everything that was never allowed to be said afterward. And that may be the most disturbing pattern of all.